Greetings from Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I'm Karen Christensen, talking to colleagues around the world about topics that I write about at Karen's Letter. We often talk about books. Sustainability is always a focus. I latched onto this saying, think globally, act locally, when I was very young. And it sums up what you'll find at this podcast about the way we live now. Good morning, John. I gather you're in Madrid now.
Good morning, Karen. Yes, I'm here for an extended period of a few months because my wife is working here on she's in a residence here at the Barcelona Center for Contemporary Culture on a big Amazonia expedition.
To catch you. I think you're my third European country to do a podcast with. So that's fun. I'm going to have to expand to other continents, obviously. But it's great. As I explained, you're the environment correspondent for The Guardian, and I think have been working in this area for years. So like me, who started my career in London, I was thrilled to see that you'd done a biography of James Lovelock, whose name and concepts have been familiar to me for a long time. But boy, were there a lot of surprises in this book. For those who don't know who James Lovelock was, can you just give us a bit of an introduction to him and his influence?
Sure. I think like you, I knew of him by reputation, first of all. I think you can't work in the field of environment without knowing the name James Lovelock. He was a British scientist, but more than that, he was an inventor and somebody who liked to explore ideas. He's best known for his part in the creation of the Gaia Theory of the Earth as a living organism, which he developed, as is very well known, in conjunction with the American biologist Lynn Margulis, and as I discovered, with another woman called Diane Hitchcock, who I believe we'll get onto a bit later.
Yes, the women in his life are certainly intriguing and an intriguing part of your book. No question about that. For environmentalists, his name was known, and I associated him with what we called the deep greens, the kind of more spiritual side of things rather than the scientific side of things. I saw him as a sort of, I think I knew he was a scientist, but I thought of him as a sort of renegade. And is that how he was thought of? It doesn't seem to be the perspective today.
Jim, as I came to know him, because I was able to write the book, I had the privilege of being able to interview him over 2 years at the end of his life. Jim was somebody who was able to appeal to an extraordinary spectrum of people in these polarized times. It's hard to imagine somebody who had an appeal on the left, on the right, with scientists doing very, very deep, groundbreaking science, particularly in atmospheric chemistry, but who was also able to appeal almost as a green guru to New Age thinkers, and that spiritual side of embracing and immersing yourself in nature that is also a very important part of appreciating and wanting to care for the environment.
Do you think the name that was given to his concept of the Earth as an organism, or their concept of the Earth as an organism of a sort, do you think that contributed to its appeal to sort of more of a spiritual sense? I mean, the naming of it's really interesting, and it kind of got a story itself. Perhaps you could explain that.
You're right there, Karen. The naming was key to everything. Gaia, of course, was the Greek goddess of the earth, a very powerful primordial deity who was quite terrifying. It's often thought of as Mother Nature, but this wasn't a caring, compassionate mother. This was a fearsome, vengeful goddess. And the fact that Jim and Lynn, Jim more than anyone, chose the name that used this a spiritual name, a name of a god, to name a scientific theory, was incredibly controversial and has set back the theory in scientific circles for a long time, but opened up the theory to a huge popular audience. And the idea, as you inferring, came from a very unusual source as well, which is Jim at that time lived in a very small village in the Wiltshire countryside of England. The village was called Bowerchalk. It's probably only 100 or 200 at most families living there. And it just so happened that one of his neighbors was the future Nobel literature winner, William Golding. And they became drinking buddies. And it was William Golding who suggested this name. He said to Jim, look, if you're going to have a theory of the Earth as a living organism, such a huge theory, you need a name on the same scale. So he said, why not Gaia Theory? And at first, Jim didn't know what Gaia was. So William Golding had to explain.
Which is, I mean, that in itself is quite amazing. But I think that Golding must have had a gift for names. I mean, Lord of the Flies, I don't know who named that book, actually. Because publishers...
No? Or publishers sometimes jump in, don't they?
Sometimes. I think that was the book that was rejected by Faber's, famously rejected by Faber's. But maybe I have to look at that story, too. But that's yet another connection with my Eliot work that I hadn't thought about. But what led you to him to write a biography? I mean, a biography, I gather you're not a biographer by trade. Yeah.
No, I'm not. I'm an environmental writer predominantly. I started writing about the environment and wrote a book about the environment when I was based in China. And I wrote an eco-travelogue at the time called When a Billion Chinese Jump. But I have been in this field now for getting close to 20 years. And Jim's name kept coming up again and again as the inventor of key devices to measure pollution, such as the electron capture detector, as the innovative thinker who came up with the Gaia theory, as someone whose studies made possible the discovery of the ozone hole. And for all of these reasons, I was very curious about him, and particularly in one incarnation around about 2006, 2007, when he wrote the book Revenge of Gaia, when he was a real prophet of doom on the climate, and in fact predicted many of the things that are happening now, though at the time many people said he was exaggerating and he was being alarmist and all the kind of things that deniers say. So I was very curious to meet him, and it was in between lockdowns during the COVID epidemic that I made a trip across the country in a camper van, so I didn't have to stay in any hotels. And I knew my route would be passing fairly close to Jim's house and his wife, Sandy. And fairly close is very relative, because Jim, throughout his life, liked to live in places that were far off the beaten track. And at this stage, he was already 101. They just celebrated his
That's right. We have to point
birthday.
That out.
He was a very long-lived man. He was already living in an old Coast Guard's cottage on Chesil Beach. But I asked if I could see him. He agreed. I was very much expecting a frail man, old man, who I'd probably get 30 minutes of an interview and then have to give my apologies because he'd be tired. And then 3 hours later, he wore me out. He just had so many incredible stories. And there he was sitting at the far end of the table with a mask, and the other end of the table with a mask, so that we didn't have any risk of infecting one another. And I'd taken tests and all the stuff we had to do at the time. And on the way out, I was just so astonished by his stories, because I knew about Gaia theory and I knew about the ozone hole stuff, but he was talking about work for MI5, developing technology for the secret services, and working for Shell, and working on air hygiene,
Uh-huh.
like disease control. So there we were in a COVID epidemic, and
Yeah.
turned out he'd been working on disease control in the Second World War. And I was, wow,
Yeah.
has anyone done your biography? And he said, well, yes, they have, but not for a couple of decades, and it's rather out of date. And
Back when I was in my 80s.
yeah, when I was a mere slip of a lad at 80 years old. And so I just, on the spur of the moment, said, you know, could I have a stab? And then there was quite an interesting story in how he accepted, which is that we were discussing this by email for several weeks. And then I had a cardiac arrest, and I needed 3 shocks to revive me. So it was, yeah, I nearly died. And there I am recovering in hospital. And Jim had found out from my wife, and he wrote to me or he sent a message, such a charming message, which was along the lines of, oh, don't worry about having heart problems when you're in your 50s. I also had heart problems when I was in my 50s, and now look at me, I've lived more than 100 years. So you've got a lot of life in you,
Buck up,
left in
lad.
you. Why do you know? And yes, let's do the biography. So that was it. That was for me,
Yeah.
life 2.0. That was my first objective, was to write Jim's biography.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's an amazing, just a fascinating book. There were so many surprising things, and things I think it's worth while for those of us who are concerned about the current state of play and the role of science and the relationship between economics and science, to talk about how his diverse career. He wasn't just a kind of greenie by any means. He was a scientist, but his career, it is, I think, certainly plenty of the, my environmentalist friends, certainly in early days, if they'd known he worked for Shell or MI5, that would not have gone over well. But then I thought, E.F. Schumacher worked for the coal board, which also seems strange. So I'd love to have your thoughts on these, his career, and did it seem to fit harmonious, or were there disconnects there?
There were, and I should say right at the beginning that Jim never attempted to hide the fact he worked for Shell. In his books, he always thanks Shell. He organized huge conferences that were sponsored by Shell, and he, throughout his life, defended industry
Uh-huh.
in its
Uh-huh.
multiple
Uh-huh.
forms,
Uh-huh.
and was actually very critical of many green thinkers. I mean, I just think he was utterly fascinating. And for me, one of the key elements of the story was how he wrestled with his life as an industrial scientist, working for Shell, working for the Chemical Manufacturers Association of the US, being on the wrong side of history, environmental history at least,
Uh-huh.
initially
Uh-huh.
on the question of ozone and CFCs and what they were doing to
Uh-huh.
the ozone layer, the stratosphere. But he would wrestle with that, and at the same time, he would be developing Gaia theory and advocating the need to protect nature. And he was an incredible lover of the countryside. I mean, that was his
Uh-huh.
passion, his absolute passion. And he wanted to reconcile these things. And I think
Uh-huh.
the fact that he tried so hard to reconcile those two things partly helps to explain why he had such a large appeal, why he was a green
Uh-huh.
environmental guru, but he was also an advisor to former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who was
Yes.
far right and all in favor of deregulation. And it surprised me. When I set out on the biography,
Uh-huh.
I wasn't aware of this at all, and I ended up writing a book that was not as I imagined I would write it.
Uh-huh.
As you say, you were surprised as a reader. I was surprised as a writer, as a researcher, about some of the things that I found, but it was all fascinating. Much of it, I think, could be traced back to his parents
Uh-huh.
and the different things they gave him. His mother he saw as somebody who was over-civilized, bossy, controlling, somewhat unfairly, I should say. But that was his impression of, you know, this is how things are. If you try to organize them too much, this is what happens. Whereas his father, who had been gone to prison for poaching and had abandoned pretty much his first two children, but was a very charming, easygoing person who loved nature and came from a rural family and would take Jim on these long walks, but who had reinvented himself after leaving prison and leaving the countryside, working for the gasworks, which in the 1920s, while Lovelock was growing up, was pretty much Silicon Valley of its age, the highest technology you had at the time. And Jim saw technology and science and industry as really benign forces that had enabled his family, and particularly his father, to improve his lot in life and improve his living standards. And I think that was the case for all of humanity, or the majority of humanity, at least until the 1950s and 60s. And then there was people started saying, oh, actually, it's not all good. There's this downside. And Jim was one of the first to see that. And getting to the crux of your question, I think it often is the scientists who are most involved in developing these new technologies that are also the first to realize their consequences, and all have to wrestle with it, and some just ignore it and stick with the job that they're given and where they get their bread and butter from, whereas others will have a moral conundrum or feel obliged to be a whistleblower or feel obliged to, as in Jim's case, develop a whole theory about how the world worked, and maybe nature can absorb this or maybe it can't. And he spent the second half of his life exploring that question.
Yes, which is a fascinating question today. I mean, how much can we absorb? But the subjects of biography, people often, I've delved into this world a lot. They quite like the idea of having a biography written, especially by a sympathetic person. But then the biographer often starts digging and finding out new things. And the subject sometimes is not happy about that. So to what extent was he concerned at his great age, a man of considerable repute, that the book would either enhance his reputation or not?
He told me that he did not expect to ever see the book. He as I said, he was 101 when we started, and he died on his birthday, his 103rd birthday, pretty much 2 years later. So he was quite, he knew this was the last thing he could share with the world was his thoughts and memories. And he said, I can tell you things that I haven't been able to tell anyone else before. And that was partly about his work for the Secret Services, where he used to joke he was a mini Q. The James Bond films always have the technician Q.
Oh, right.
In it, who invents gadgets for Bond to take for 007.
Let's go down to the basement
on his missions. Yes, exactly. So Jim would say, I'm a mini Q. I was a mini Q. He would invent various gadgets for detecting things mostly, or tracing people. And he did a lot of work on bomb disposal techniques. And I think maybe the thing is, I'm digressing slightly, but I'll get back to the question in a second. But I think the single comment that sort of summed him up best was from his younger daughter, Jane, who said, my father has two loves. One, the natural world, and two, bombs. And really, I think most people kind of know him for the
interesting contrast.
Not bombs. And even as a child, he used to make bombs, and it was he did it to entertain his parents, and then he did it to entertain his children, and he would
Children.
because he couldn't be bothered to dig a hole in the garden, so he'd make a bomb instead.
Mm-hmm.
And then he did bomb disposal more than bomb creation,
Mm-hmm.
told me,
Mm-hmm.
um, right towards the end of his life, and said he probably Britain's longest serving spy. Um, oh, and there were letters on his wall and in his documents from C, the
Mm-hmm.
head of the British Secret Services, thanking him for his long and distinguished service. And C even wrote, not just on behalf of Britain, but because of the work you do for Gaia, as a citizen of of the planet. So
Wow.
yes, so there was all of these things that emerged during our discussions,
Mm-hmm.
and that were very interwoven with the discovery of Gaia theory or
Mm-hmm.
development
Mm-hmm.
of Gaia theory. And as Jim would say, everything connected with
Everything
everything
connects.
else.
Right.
So the work from Shell opened his eyes to what was going on with pollution. The work for with the tracing work for the secret services opened his eyes to how to identify and track patterns, movements of certain gases that led to greater understanding of pollution and what was going on in the stratosphere, and so on. Everything
Mm-hmm.
overlapped. So he was able to talk much more about that because of where he was in his life. So, in a
Yes.
sense, to answer your question,
Mm-hmm.
it, he never asked me to write, "Will you write a positive story?"
Mm-hmm.
And he never said, "I really want you to do it this way or do it that way."
Mm-hmm.
And I think that his proximity to death, and in one sense,
Mm-hmm.
my recent close proximity to death through the cardiac arrest,
Yeah.
that kind of created a
A
bond
bond of
between
some.
us.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I would
we were
think
able to
so.
talk with this awareness that actually anything we think of or anything we're worried about is actually fairly insignificant in the broader scale of things.
Uh-huh.
So let's just
Uh-huh.
try to find out more about life and more about what Jim's life meant. And I think he and he said he really looked forward to our interviews, and his wife said he really looked forward to our interviews, and I certainly did, and found them very innovating.
Mm-hmm.
And he, I'm not a therapist by any means, but you end up talking a lot about how did this relate to your mother and how did this relate to your father, and then he was like, I hadn't really thought of that, but that's really interesting. Let's explore that and
Uh-huh.
things like that.
What about his did you feel he was unburdening himself when it came to his relationships with women, which, were varied and not always, did not always end well. I mean, that to me that was one of the really interesting things. And I actually went and I looked in our various books where there's stuff, he wrote the piece on in this, he wrote the piece on at what age? I don't know. He was pretty old then, the Gaia theory. And there's a reference to Lynn Margulis, but there's no reference to it. I don't know if it's Dion or Diane.
It's Diane.
Hitchcock.
Yeah.
But that was certainly a surprising thing, and I wonder about because that obviously for him was something new to talk about. But you then interviewed her, and I think that readers or listeners would be very interested to hear about a bit about his James Lovelock's love life.
Mm. Yeah. Was it an unburdening? He never used that word, so
Uh-huh.
I shouldn't try to
Uh-huh.
put those words in his mouth. I think Jim's theory of evolution was that humanity is moving to the stage where we are converting our knowledge into data as we become more machine-like. That was his last published book. The Nova Scene was very much about that kind of very cybernetic view of the future. So by kind of downloading his brain to an extent into my recorder and my
Uh-huh.
notebook,
Uh-huh.
I think there was an element of that. But he didn't go out of his way to talk about his love affairs. And I asked him, because in his own memoirs, which were published at the turn of the century, he had alluded to a close relationship with
Uh-huh.
Diane Hitchcock
Uh-huh.
and others, that I was able to follow up on and that I asked him about. But he did say, for the first time, I was in love with Diane Hitchcock.
Uh-huh.
I couldn't even tell her that I was in love with
Uh-huh.
her, but I was at the time, and that
Uh-huh.
she influenced me far more than I can say. So it turned out that Diane Hitchcock was far more influential than anybody realized in the formation of the Gaia Theory, and that Jim had had an affair with her while they were both working at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California,
Uh-huh.
on a project to see if they could identify life on Mars. Jim was helping to develop the technology for that, and Diane was working for NASA as a sort of a consultant, an analyst, and spy, essentially, for NASA to see if
Uh-huh.
that was being used in an effective way. And they had this affair that lasted several months at least, and possibly several years. They were both a bit
Uh-huh.
hazy about the duration. And it was Diane, when you go through the records, it was Diane who made the first mention in one of her internal reports about the possibility that the Earth was a living organism,
Uh-huh.
and that you needed to analyze the atmosphere to detect life. And that was the breakthrough that led to the Gaia
Uh-huh.
theory. And so, yes, it was fascinating that Jim revealed just how close they had been. And it was also fascinating to learn just how intellectually important she was to some of his later theories. And yeah, there was a
And you went to talk
mm,
to her then, because
mm.
she wasn't young at that point. She wasn't that much younger than he, right? She must
No,
have.
she was less than 20. I mean, she was younger than him, but
Yeah.
only by, I can't remember exactly, 16 or 18 years or something like
Yeah.
that. So she was probably in her 80s.
Right.
Yeah, I think she was in her
but
80s,
but you
and
were able to talk to her.
it took a year to find her.
Uh-huh.
Um, and wow, I wrote to her and told her what the project was, and she wrote back to say, I'm really not sure I'm up for this, because it
Mm.
it was an emotionally it left a powerful emotional mark even decades later. And she said, give me some time to think about it. And eventually she
Uh-huh.
wrote back and said, yes, I would like to talk to you, but the
Yeah.
condition is you must watch this documentary about the difficult situation that women scientists were in the
Uh-huh.
1960s. And that was a precondition. I watched that documentary, and that led to everything else. And we had several discussions, and Diane is utterly fascinating, very funny, a very powerful
Uh-huh.
intellect. And she told me an amusing story about how when Jim and Diane first met, it was in a canteen at the JPL. And apparently Diane introduced herself as saying, oh, do you know, your name is a polite version of my name. So Lovelock, Hitchcock, uh, and that made Jim laugh. Uh, and it was from that moment
And
on
she
that
was
they
quite
realized nothing
saucy
in
if
common.
if
She was
she was.
pretty saucy. Yes, she was. And and it was also very poignant because
Mm.
it took you know it took several months it took several months until Jim said, yes, I was in love with
Uh-huh.
her. And when I relayed this to Diane, she said, oh, he never told me. He never told me at the time. And she said she was sobbing when she found
Yeah.
that out. So
It's
yeah, all those years later, decades later, to
that's an
realize.
experience for a biographer, I have to say, to be able to convey that. I think that's very touching, and just to give her due, and to do it in conjunction with really writing something that introduces him as well. I think it's you've really given us a gift.
Oh, fuck you. That's extremely kind.
Really, really interesting. Well, is there anything else you'd like to point out that I haven't, that you'd like readers to remember about him, or that you'd like to point out in particular, especially at this this point in human history?
I guess the two things that stand out is that one that Jim was always searching. Curiosity drove him, many a scientist, and it eventually drove him to realize that even though he'd worked for the oil and gas industry for more than a decade, that at the end of his life, he blamed the oil and gas industry for not acting sooner, because he had warned them. There's a lot of talk today about when was Exxon first warned about the dangers of fossil fuels and how they affect the climate. And that was in the 70s. But Jim warned Shell in the 60s. And it's all there. The documentary record couldn't be clearer. And that's all spelled out in the book. So I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Moral and legal reasons. I think that's incredibly important. But then the other thing I would say is that Jim had a really mischievous sense of humor, was quite happy to stir things up, didn't mind shocking people, and had this not just a sort of a worthy, earnest naturalist side, which he did have, but he also had this mischievous, secretive bomb maker side. And they kind of came together one time when we went for a walk together, because even though he was over 100, he loved to go walking. And he was walking until, I think, 6 months or several months before his death. And one time we were walking along the beach with Sandy, his wife, and he saw a car parked in an area where it shouldn't have been parked on the beach. And the tires were on some plants, some rare plants that were endemic to that area. And he looked at me with a mischievous eye and said, "Oh, I wish I still had all my bomb-making materials. I would have got rid of that."
I could just imagine you. Do you have any photos of you with him?
Yes.
I would love to.
I can send. I'll send you one.
That would be grand. Like. I'm picturing this scene now. It would be nice to see you with him. Well, thank you so much for taking time to talk about the book and about these. I mean, what a fascinating character. I really look forward to sharing this.
Thank you very much, Karen. It's been a pleasure talking to you about Jim.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Yes, you too. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you for joining me at The Way We Live Now, a podcast where we roam the world for ideas and inspiration and talk about tools that will help to make the world a better place. I'd really love to have your ideas and comments. Please leave a comment below and subscribe to the feed. You can sign up for my newsletter, which I try to make a real letter, at karenchristensen.substack.com.